They say peace is the sound of water, quiet, steady, and certain. And for 23 years, that sound was the heartbeat of my property, a wide, shimmering pond nestled in a curve of ancient cottonwoods where the grass stayed lush and the soil held on to its secrets long after the summer sun had scorched everything else to a crisp. I bought this place after 30 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, back when my knees still worked well enough for a morning jog and my soul was tired of moving from base to base, craving nothing more than a few acres of dirt I could finally call my own. The house sits on the jagged edge of a development called Whispering Pines, a name that, in typical suburban fashion, is entirely fraudulent since the only things whispering around here are the neighbors behind their closed curtains. And for the longest time, I lived in a state of blissful, grandfathered in isolation. My land was a relic of the county's old boundaries, a 3-acre island of wildness surrounded by a sea of identical beige houses with their regulation mailboxes and their precisely 2.5 trees per front yard, all governed by a homeowners association that had expanded its territory like a hungry empire back in 2003. I paid my dues just to keep the peace, even though they technically had no jurisdiction over my dirt. But as long as they left my vegetable garden and my pond alone, I didn't oppose. Mind playing nice with the suburban bureaucrats. That pond wasn't oppose. Just a scenic feature, you see. It was a piece of natural engineering, a recharge zone that captured every drop of rainfall and let it sink slowly, patiently, into the deep aquifer that fed my private well, and while the rest of the neighborhood suffered through city water restrictions and brittle brown lawns during the August droughts, my squash and tomatoes stayed green because I understood the balance of the land. But balance is a concept that people like Brenda Vance simply cannot comprehend. And the moment she was elected HOA president, I knew the quiet years were over because Brenda is the kind of woman who smiles like a shark in a silk scarf and wields a clipboard like it's a holy relic. She has this vision of, end quote, visual unity, end quote, a term that sounds vaguely like a cult philosophy. And at her very first community meeting, she flashed drone shots of my property onto a giant screen, pointing at my pond like it was a crime scene and calling it a, end quote, non-conforming water feature, end quote, that posed a threat to community cohesion. I sat in the back of that room, my coffee going cold in my hand, listening to her talk about how unmanaged water was a breeding ground for mosquitoes and a, end quote, downward pressure, end quote, on property values. And when I stood up, my old Army posture kicking in, and tried to explain the hydrology of the area, how that pond was the only thing keeping the local water table stable, she just gave me this thin, pitying smile and said, end quote, now, Mr. Miller, we all appreciate your hobby, but the experts we've consulted suggest a more curated approach to our shared landscape, end quote. The first real warning shot came a week later in the form of a certified letter, formal and cold, demanding that I begin, end quote, remediation and drainage, end quote, of the pond to bring the terrain into a visually harmonious state, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked because I truly thought they were bluffing. I didn't oppose. Respond, choosing instead to spend my evenings on the dock with a notebook, logging the arrival of the great blue herons and the way the dragonflies skimmed the surface like tiny neon helicopters, thinking that if I just ignored the madness, it would eventually drift away like a summer storm. But Brenda wasn't an oppose, a storm. She was a slow, grinding glacier, and she began a campaign of subtle erosion, sending, end quote, beautification inspectors, end quote, to stand on the public easement and take photos of my tall grass, turning my neighbors against me by whispering that my, end quote, stagnant pool, end quote, was the reason their kids had bug bites. I watched one of my neighbors, a decent enough guy named Greg who used to borrow my post-hole digger, actually rip out a 30-year-old oak tree because Brenda told him it wasn't an oppose, on, end quote, approved botanical list, end quote. And when I saw him standing there over the stump with a look of pure, hollow defeat, I realized that these people weren't an oppose. Just managing a neighborhood. Hodang ko gang zoa bon moi, Thursday kong the keem sot duak. The tension reached a boiling DM on a Tuesday night in October. A night so quiet you could hear the cottonwood leaves clicking against each other, and I went to bed feeling a strange, prickling sense of unease that I hadn't and oppose. T felt since I was stationed in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. I woke up at 5:30, the sky still a bruised purple, and stepped out onto the porch with my mug of black coffee, expecting to hear the usual morning chorus of bullfrogs and the soft splash of a turtle slipping off a log. But instead, there was a silence so heavy it felt like a weight in my chest. I walked down the slope, my boots crunching on the frost, and when I reached the edge of the cottonwoods, I froze. The pond was gone. Where there should have been a shimmering mirror of water, there's only a vast, stinking crater of black, rotting muck, the dock sitting crooked and pathetic like a skeleton rising out of a mass grave. And for a second, I honestly thought the earth had simply opened up and swallowed it whole. But then I saw it. On the western edge, hidden behind a thicket of overgrown sumac, someone had dug a clean, professional trench through the embankment, a deep channel that had bled the life out of my land and redirected it into the HOA and Oppos as concrete drainage ditch over the course of the night. It wasn't an Oppos, just a prank. It was a tactical strike, executed with the kind of precision that only someone with a surveyor's map and a total lack of soul could pull off. And as I stood there in the mud, watching a single confused fish flop in a shallow puddle, the grief for that water turned into a white-hot rage that made my hands shake. I didn't in Oppos. Called Brenda. I called the sheriff's department, but the deputy who showed up just sighed and looked at his shoes, telling me that since the HOA claimed they were performing, in quote, emergency drainage for public safety, in quote, on an easement-adjacent area, it was a civil matter, not a criminal one, in quote. You and Oppos. LL need a lawyer, Mr. Miller, in quote. He said, and I told him I didn't in Oppos. Just need a lawyer. I needed a priest because I was about to bury this board under the weight of their own arrogance. I went back to the house and pulled up the footage from the motion sensor cameras I'd hidden in the trees. And there they were, 3 men in reflective vests, Brenda standing there in her expensive hiking boots, holding a flashlight like a torch, watching as a mini excavator tore a hole in my heart at 2 in the morning. I spent the next 4 hours at City Hall, digging through the dusty archives of the planning and zoning department, and that's when I found the smoking gun. And, quote, temporary drainage permit, and, quote, Brenda had filed under a false pretext, claiming the trench was part of a stormwater project on city-owned easement land, when she knew damn well it was cutting straight into my private property. But the universe has a funny way of balancing the scales, and the reckoning began at exactly 8:05 that morning when the first scream echoed through the cul-de-sac. It was Mrs. Gable, a woman who treated her rose garden like a cathedral, and when she turned on her spigot to water her prize-winning blooms, all she got was a wet, sputtering hiss and a cloud of rusty air. Within 20 minutes, the entire north side of Whispering Pines was in a state of total panic. People were running out of their houses in their bathrobes, tapping on their water meters, shouting at their smart home apps, and looking at their dry faucets as if they'd been cursed by a vengeful god. Because Brenda Vance, in her infinite beige-tinted wisdom, had an Oppos, bothered to consult a hydrologist before she pulled the plug on my pond, and she didn't an Oppos. Realized that my, in quote, non-conforming water feature, in quote, was the literal cap on the local aquifer. Once that pressure was gone, the water table for the entire ridge dropped 4 feet in 6 hours, leaving every shallow well in the neighborhood high and dry. I stood on my porch and watched the chaos unfold like a scene from a disaster movie, sipping a fresh cup of coffee from my kitchen sink. Because I'd built my well deep, I'd built it right, and I'd shielded it from the very disaster I knew was coming. By noon, Brenda was out on the street with a megaphone, her hair frizzing in the humidity, trying to tell everyone it was and quote, temporary city infrastructure failure, and quote, but I walked down to the edge of my lawn with a stack of printed out maps and the hydrology report I'd kept in my file since 1999. I didn't in Oppos say a word to her. I just handed the papers to Greg, who was looking at his dying lawn with tears in his eyes, and I watched the realization spread from house to house like a wildfire. The man they'd spent months vilifying was the only reason they'd had water in the first place, and the woman they'd elected to, in quote, protect their values, in quote, had just flushed their daily lives down the drain. The group chat for the neighborhood, which usually consisted of complaints about trash cans and grass height, turned into a digital lynch mob, and by that evening, there was a line of people in my back gate with empty milk jugs and camping coolers, looking ashamed and desperate. I didn't in Oppos. T turned them away. I'm a soldier, not a monster, but I made them wait, and, as I filled their containers for my working well, I made sure they looked at the mud-filled crater that used to be a sanctuary, making them see exactly what, in quote, visual unity, in quote, looked like when it was stripped of its marketing buzzwords. Brenda tried to stop me, actually walking onto my property and telling me I couldn't and Oppos. T, in quote, distribute unregulated water, in quote. But before I could even open my mouth, Greg and 4 other guys stepped between us, and the look Greg gave her, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, was enough to make her retreat back to her Mercedes without another word. The legal battle that followed was a bloodbath. My lawyer, a sharp-eyed veteran named Sarah who specialized in land use, didn't in Oppos. T just sued for the destruction of the pond. She sued for environmental negligence, trespassing, and fraud, and we didn't in Oppos. T stopped at the HOA's insurance policy. We went after the board members personally for, in quote, willful and malicious disregard of established property rights, end quote. And when the city's Environmental Oversight Committee got a look at the illegal trenching and the resulting aquifer collapse, they hit the HOA with fines that had enough zeros to make the board's collective head spin. The deposition was the highlight of my year. Watching Brenda Vance try to explain to a court-appointed master why she thought a, in quote, beautification initiative, in quote, justified a midnight excavating mission was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. And when she finally broke down and admitted she just, in quote, hated how the wildness looked from her bedroom window, end quote, the judge actually leaned over the bench and asked her if she'd ever considered moving to an apartment in the city where nature couldn't end Oppos. T offender. The HOA board didn't end Oppos. T just resigned. They disintegrated, and the subsequent special election brought in a group of people who actually knew how to use a shovel and respect a boundary line. With Carmen, a young mother from down the street who'd been the first to apologize to me, taking the lead as the new president. The restoration of the pond took 6 months and a small army of volunteers from the local university's environmental science department. And as we regrade the basin and planted native reeds and water lilies, the neighborhood started to feel like a community for the first time in 20 years, not because we all had the same mailboxes, but because we all shared a stake in the land again. The first time the great blue heron came back, landing on the new dock and staring at the shimmering water as if checking to see if it was real, I sat there and cried. Not for the win, but for the fact that the silence was finally gone. Today, the pond is deeper, cleaner, and officially protected by conservation easement that even the most ambitious HOA president can in Oppos. T-touch, and we renamed the area, in quote. The Miller Recharge, in quote. A little jab at Brenda that makes me smile every time I see the sign. I still grow my squash and tomatoes, and my lawn is still a little too long for some people's taste, but no one says a word anymore, and sometimes in the evenings, I see my neighbors sitting on the benches we installed near the water, just listening to the frogs and the wind in the cottonwoods. It's funny how a group of people can be so obsessed with the, in quote, view, in quote, that they forget what they're actually looking at, and it took a total disaster to make them realize that the most beautiful things in life aren't in Oppos. T, the ones we curate, but the ones we have the courage to leave alone. But it makes me wonder, how many other neighborhoods are out there right now, letting a few people in beige suits dictate the rhythm of their lives in exchange for a, in quote, harmonious, in quote, streetscape? Was it worth the fight, or did I just replace one kind of control with another? I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever had to stand your ground against a board that thought they owned the dirt under your feet? Or is the, in quote, unity, in quote, of an HOA worth the sacrifice of a little wildness? Let me know in the comments, because I'm starting to think that the real, in quote, hazard, in quote, ISN and Oppos, T, the water on our land. It's the walls we build around ourselves in the name of property values.